Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. We're here with the one and only Benjamin C. George, aka Mr. Wizard. It's been a while since we talked, my friend. How are things going?
Well, I mean, that depends on your perspective, I guess. For me, not too bad. For the world, well, it's some interesting times, huh?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I don't think anyone would have thought that all of these things could have happened in a year when we look at just the acceleration from COVID to the war in Ukraine to train derailments to bank bailouts. It's almost like there's this great reset right in front of us.
Well, it's only been being advertised for a while.
So I guess my question to you is, Ben, will you own nothing and will you be happy about it?
Well, I probably will owe nothing. I'm not sure I'll be so happy about it, though.
Yeah, I think what they mean is, you're either going to laugh or you're going to cry because you can't do both.
Well, it's that false choice, right?
It is.
You're gonna laugh or cry. You don't have a third option.
Yeah. So I got a few headlines lined up. Let's just go ahead and jump into this first one here and
All right.
give the people some ideas here. So the first set of headlines comes to us from globalresearch.ca. Bankrupt banks, food crisis, mandatory vaccine, and our grim future. This time, the virus has infected money itself. What say you about that particular type of headline?
Well, that's definitely a clickbait headline for sure, huh? I was actually thinking about this when we decided to do some podcasting. I think we talked about this whole bank stuff some 8 months ago, and it's fascinating. It's one of those things. It's like you call it, and then all of a sudden it happens, and you go, "Well, I guess that did happen." Um, yeah, have you looked into this much?
Well, I think that we run in the same circles and we probably try to scan the news for lots of different things. And it's almost uncanny, the idea of the conspiracy theorist. I heard somebody saying that the difference between conspiracy theorist and conspiracy fact is about 6 months. And it doesn't take long to see what's been happening. We heard about all these things coming out and everyone said they were crazy with the lab leak theory. Oh, you guys are crazy. But sure enough, it's getting to the point where it can't be hidden anymore. And so if that's true, and some of the things about the vaccine are true, then, why wouldn't the whole idea of the Great Reset be true?
Well, I think when we talked about it originally, we were just quoting what people had said on
Right.
stage at things like the World Economic Forum. I mean,
Right.
I, yeah, you get labeled by the mainstream as conspiracy theory, but is it a conspiracy theory when, you have the richest people in the world kind of broadcasting it far and wide? It's pretty wild.
Yeah. I had some thoughts about, when this whole train derailment happened in East Palestine, it really pulled back the curtain for me on what, and this is just my opinion, I don't know, but, and maybe this has been happening for a long time, but you really got to see the state capitalism model that happens in China happening right here in the US. Like, it has probably been happening for quite some time, but no
Mhm.
government at all is helping out with East Palestine. That's all done by Norfolk. And they have their own private security in there. They have their own lawyers. They brought in their own third party testing. It's kind of an oxymoron, their own third party testing. And isn't it interesting that those same people had a digital ID provided to them like a week or 2 weeks before the derailment happened? It's just, there's just so much there. There's so many moving parts. And another, as I'm throwing that out there, here's another part that I'd like to get your opinion on. A lot of those gases that were in those that we even know about, a lot of those gases are used to make weapons, whether they are,
Yeah.
and that's something no one's talking about. So it's interesting to think about. What say you about those two ideas?
Well, it is. It's kind of the, these things have been happening for a while, but this is kind of like where the rubber meets the road. This is where the vast privatization of things, the deregulation of those private industries via capitalist means, via lobbying, via all this stuff, this is this is the reality of those situations, similar to the banking stuff that we're watching unfold right now. I was looking into that a little bit, and it was very interesting. Apparently, Silicon Valley Bank has $80 billion in treasury bonds that they bought at a 1.5% yield. And now there's another like 13 banks that got stopped trading today. And if you go and look at their books, all of these banks bought up, at least from my initial calculation, over $500 billion of treasury bonds at a 1.5% yield.
Wow.
Yeah, and so now that interest rates are, what they are now, nobody wants to buy a 1.5% yield bond. So all that becomes basically just wasted money. And as all these collapse, it'll just consolidate this whole banking system, and you just removed 25% of the players on the board. And I think that's similar to what we're seeing happen in, not just the railways, but also, all the food stuff that's happening in the supply chains in every industry. So, this is kind of I would say how runaway capitalism plays out on a global scale.
Like a mass consolidation, and
yeah.
I'm curious too, when I think about the banking bailouts that happened today, how many of those guys were shorting the other banker's stock? Like, I mean, it's almost like they're eating themselves after a while. Like, they all know they're going down, so let's short everybody while it's going down, and then we'll get the bailout on top of it.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, if the CEO, the chief resource officer, basically all the executive suite, they started selling off stuff about a month ago. And then, I saw somebody put in a $7,500 short right before this all happened. Just $7,500 worth $2.2 million.
Wow.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it further shows that there's definitely, especially when you correlate all of the treasury bonds and all of those things, somebody had a great scheme to sit down with all of these leaders of all of these banks and say, hey, this is where you invest all of that customer money that you're sitting on. And, whether they knew interest rates were going to rise, it's kind of wild to me, because it's like at that time when interest rates, went above zero, we already knew that we were going into inflation and that the Fed was going to raise these rates. Yet you're talking $500 billion got spent on bonds that were 1.5%. It's an interesting game.
Yeah, I think that the CEO of SVB was also a principal at the San Francisco Fed when he was immediately fired. But like if that's not insider trading, if that's not collusion, if that's not just the most obvious form of corruption possible, I don't know what is. Like everybody knew, and I don't understand. Like, we've crossed the idea of moral hazard without a doubt. That's moral hazard. Sure. I mean, out there in front of everybody, and the government, the Fed, all the banks are just high-fiving each other. Like, yeah, look, we pulled it off. We stole everybody's money, and we're all going to get reimbursed and get bonuses for it. I don't understand why people aren't in prison. I don't understand why the gears haven't jammed up and there's not people in the streets. It's crazy.
Because it's legal. So there is an obscure piece of legislation that was passed that allowed these banks to do exactly that, and allowed the executive officers to offload their stock. And it wasn't considered insider trading. So what they did is actually legal.
It's criminal. I mean,
well, it's definitely criminal, but it's legal. It's so,
Yeah, it is. It's mind-blowing me to think of all those things that are happening. And, on one level, I think it's Hanlon's razor that says, don't contribute to malice what could be contributed to stupidity.
Right.
And, maybe it is just the collapse of the dollar and everything is going by the wayside and people are taking their shots where they can. And, the idea that because the dollar is failing, there's no more regulation, there's no money to regulate stuff, so corporations can just run roughshod over everything, or maybe there's a more, something else in play. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, to attribute it to stupidity, I definitely could see Hanlon's razor applying. But then you start to look at some of the evidence, like the treasury bonds and all of this other pieces of evidence, and it's not just a single bank, it's a multitude of banks. So, at some level, whether that have been, cigars and whiskey in a back room, just everybody glad handing saying, oh, yeah, this is going to be a win, or it was something a bit more malicious than that. I think the evidence suggests that there was some sort of coordination behind this. Now, who is pulling those strings? Just like everything else, the easiest way to find that answer is to watch where the money flows. The people who go up and buy off, SVB and all these other banks and buy that debt pennies on the dollar, that'll tell you, kind of at least who was aware of the game that was being played.
Yeah, I like that idea of it. To think of it as a giant poker game, and there's these people sitting at a table. On one hand, there's a lot of people that have been pushing for zero interest rates and haven't been getting them. A lot of the zombie corporations that want to buy their stock back at 0%. A lot of the people sitting in boardrooms want that 0% free money. A lot of, like the car companies that can't really compete. Everybody wants the rates to go back to zero so they can have the easy money again. And, banks too, banks making the risky bets. On some level, it wouldn't take, if you had a pretty good hand, if you're the CEO of SVP and some other bankers, that's a pretty big hand just to say, look, we'll bluff them. We'll throw our cards down. Let's call their bluff. You're not going to bail us out. Let's see. Not only do they get bailed out, but Jerome Powell goes from an 80% chance of a 50% basis rate hike to now almost a 0% chance of a 50% base, rate hike. So there's that. Another question I have is that the SVB bank, they did a lot with the startups and technologies, and you hear about how there's all this tech involved, but it wasn't just Silicon Valley. It was also their branches in Israel and the United Kingdom. Right. HSBC, which is the Hong Kong, I think that's the bank out of Hong Kong, Shanghai, maybe the HSBC, they bought the bank in UK. So are they now the people that own those startup tech companies? Did they just acquire all that tech by buying that bank?
No, it doesn't work that way. Okay. Basically what happens is they buy up all of the bad debt, quote unquote. So they'll get it on pennies on a dollar, which means, so like when you have an FDIC insured bank, right? Each individual depositors, supported up to $250,000. Well, it turns out that SVB, 93% of their total investment volume, which was, 220 some billion dollars, wasn't covered by FDIC because, you have these big tech startups, you have venture capitalists, you had other bank investments. And so what they'll do is they'll buy up all of that unsecured debt. And what happens is then they basically have the choice as a private institution to say, okay, you had $1 million with us, but now you only have $250,000 with us due to all of this fallout of what happened. So basically, they don't own the tech, but they own the tech's money, and they kind of have it by the balls, right? So yeah, it's a very big consolidation of economic power, not necessarily technical power.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to bring up. Man, I'm not even sure where to take it from here. Like, things have been so crazy. Like, if you were to throw a dart at the board and try to guess what happens next, where do you think that dart would land?
Oh gosh. I mean, in what direction? I think we're going to see, this is going to have, this could be like we talked about a Franz Ferdinand moment in podcast past. This could very well be that. There's nothing that's triggered more animosity and wars in the world than wealth, right? Or the lack thereof. resources being probably a distant second, even though it directly equates to wealth. But I think I think we're definitely going to see a continued collapse of these investment banking systems, where it's interesting because we saw it with FTX that started it.
Right.
Hey, we're going to use customer funds and we're going to go off and make sketchy bets. Well, sketchy bets can pay off, but most of the time they don't. That's why they're sketchy bets. And I think this is probably just a domino event. I think we're going to see a fallout for quite a few investment banks across the world, because everything, like we've talked about before, is pegged to the US dollar via the petrodollar, and in a whole lot of things. Now, I think something that we'll see is this is going to give a rise to BRICS. I think we're definitely going to see massive movement in the economic sector on where money lies, how investment lies. One thing I don't think we'll see is we won't see anything from like a Congress that says, hey, you guys can't do this anymore. Because I think there's direct beneficiaries that stand as basically gatekeepers in that system.
Yeah, if we've learned anything, it's that the idea we have been taught about government is completely false. And it's sad to think about that. And I don't know if enough people understand that the country that they live in, the United States of America, doesn't function like they think it does. It's not we the people, for the people, by the people. It's just, and there's no justice. It's just us. And by us, I mean it's the ruling class. It's an oligarchy that run things. And if you just pan back a little bit, you can say, okay, Elon Musk is the technology czar. Jeff Bezos is the commerce czar. And you have all these oligarchs that are in charge of different industries. Norfolk, Virginia, like they're in charge of the Midwest Railroad, and not the government. The government can't even go in there. They don't even want Pete. Hey, Pete, don't even come here. Biden, don't come here. We don't want you guys testing stuff. We don't want you here. And you begin to see who's really pulling the levers of power. One thing I'm thinking about on this idea of the financial front is the introduction of CBDCs. I don't know if they're ready, but we've seen the end of FTX. We've seen everybody taken down except Binance, and they have gone out of their way to try to get Binance down. Haven't done it yet.
It's actually probably just starting. Coinbase just suspended Binance's USD peg today.
Oh, okay.
So I would expect in the next week or two to start seeing that unfurl.
And if I put on my tinfoil hat, I would say that that's the last off ramp for cash. That's the last off ramp to get your money into any sort of crypto vehicle that was a big boy. We have Coinbase, which is the American sanctioned off ramp, which is governed by the oligarchs. And Binance is the only semi-autonomous one left. I guess you have decentralized stuff, or what do you think?
Right, not really. I mean, Binance is a massive player. They are the biggest player, bar none. But there's the thing about crypto is that you can roll up a crypto exchange based out of one of the almost 200 countries on this planet, right? And they have different regulations, different stipulations. Now, what we'll see is a tightening of that. Like you won't be able to go to Binance and use that as the ramp on and off for dollars. But what'll happen is there'll still be other exchanges, and more of them will rise because they'll cater to that market. But it'll just continue to be a tightening of that. There's also peer-to-peer decentralized exchanges. So I can, I'll say one Bitcoin for $24,000 today, and you send wire transfer $24,000 to my bank, and I send you a Bitcoin. However, because of what's happening, because of all of these different banks going belly up, there's only going to be a few players left on the board. And if they decide to deny the ability to send wire transfers for crypto or things like that, that's when the off ramps disappear, and that's when you have the advent of CBDCs kind of pushing crypto out of the market, so to speak.
Yeah, it's too. Gosh, it was, it was told to us that you know, that the CBDCs are coming. It was told to us that, we are going to see hyperinflation, and it's just like, here it is. I guess I don't really know about inflation, but here's one of the things I was thinking about when it comes to what the Fed was trying to do. And from what I had read, Jerome Powell was on a rampage to try to stop people from buying stuff. There was too much people out there consuming, so he's trying to get consumption down. The way they were doing that is you move up rates, people get fired, they can't afford stuff, businesses tighten up. And that was the plan of the Fed. By raising up rates, you were going to clamp down on people consuming things. But it seems to me when you start bailing everybody out, you just open the spigot to consumption. You're giving the millionaires and billionaires and you're telling the banks, here's unlimited money for you. So isn't that going to drive demand up?
Well, you have to realize that that's consumption for a small group of people.
That's a good point.
Not for the general people. And I think, even these bailouts that they're talking about. So I heard that, the taxpayers aren't going to be bailing out the banks, but yet we have this money to bail out the banks. I was like, well, wait a second. Where does the government get its money? I'm pretty sure they get it from taxpayers. They don't really get it from anywhere else. So at some level, that has to be taxpayer money, and it is. And so after 2008, they established this basically a bailout fund, essentially. And but it's not a complete bailout. So I think the fund is only like $50 billion, and SVB alone has over $200 billion in liabilities. So, even if they get that bailout, then it becomes, you're going to get 35-40% of whatever you had in that bank type idea. And then the rest would be, if they decided to liquidate the bank's assets, then they would pay you back whatever they could earn from those assets.
Yeah, I originally thought that there was going to be a haircut, but from what I'm hearing, there's no haircut. Like everyone's going to they're going to make everybody whole, and they're not talking about a 50% or 70% or 7% haircut. They're like, yeah, guess what? No problems. We got it all covered. And if they only have 50 billion in that particular account, that TARP type account, then that money has to come from the taxpayers. That's a full blown bailout.
Right. And it's taxpayer money, whether that was taxpayer money in 2012 or 2016 or whatnot, it's still taxpayer money.
Yeah.
So there's, and that they could have other funds available to that. That was just one thing I read about that particular fund that the federal government established after 2008. So, there could be other funds and they could make people whole. At the same time, they could just print out a few more $1 trillion and make people whole. We're already $30+ trillion in debt. What's another couple trillion, right?
Yeah. It's such a joke at this point in time. It's like, we're talking about inflation and we're talking about people losing their jobs, but there's no shortage of money for Ukraine. There's whatever you want. You want $1 trillion? No problem. Oh, the banks bailed out? No problem. Like, it's such a sham for anybody, whether you're a politician, a banker, all these CEOs. I can't understand how these people sleep at night when they're just wrecking the very country that gave them everything that they had ever wanted, the country that gave them their dreams, the place they made their fortune, their families, and they just. When I think about Jerome Powell, when I think about people at the Fed, I think about somebody who was born into an incredible wealth and has so much opportunity, went to all the best schools. You don't get to be the head of the Fed by going to a public school. This guy was given everything and that was given to him by the sacrifice and the sweat off the brow of working people. Hey, let's give these people, these are the best and the brightest. Let's give them everything and they're going to make the good decisions. The people gave him everything. And he just turned around and took a big steamer on everybody. And that's what they do. Like, people in positions, it seems to me, people in high-ranking positions of authority care nothing about people that make under a certain dollar amount. And I don't understand why that doesn't translate into full-out revolt, or will it?
Well, and we've talked about this before, but I think this is the breaking of nation states, because I think eventually it does. Eventually, it gets too much of a burden for the populace to bear.
Right.
Now I think that's not going to be an instantaneous thing. It'll be a long drawn out thing, and it won't be it'll be a regional thing. It'll happen in segments, right? And yeah, how those people sleep at night, brought to you by Pfizer. Here, take an Ambien, right? They don't. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to sleep well. I mean, even narcissists have a conscience at some level, especially when they're confronted with the amount of pain that they generate in the world. And it's really, I think, even if you shelter yourself, you're going to realize that you're generating pain in the world.
Yeah.
At some visceral level.
Yeah, maybe this is part of it. Maybe, obviously, you and I get to see the ramifications of decisions that were made. Maybe people that are sitting at a higher perch realize, hey, these people are coming for us. We need to start closing some banks. The interest rates are not working the way we thought it was. We thought there was going to be more layoffs. These people are not quitting. They're not stopping consuming. Like, we're going to need to ratchet it up a little bit. And when you look at it from that level, it begins to look a little bit more orchestrated. You have a guy that was the CEO of a bank that also worked at the Fed. Like, to think that guy didn't, birds of a feather flock together. The guy worked at the Fed. Like, that seems to me, you could make the argument that it was a move. It was a plan. It was a strategy that was implemented.
I would agree. And if we look at history, it's not like this is an uncommon event.
Right.
A lot of people are more familiar with the term old money versus new money. And, there's always that contention between those two groups. And so this is a good way for old money to wipe off new money. Now, there's a few people who've, transitioned from, new money to part of the group, but not many. And if you want to limit that scope, because then that increases your potential, I mean, from a game theory perspective, it's a pretty logical move.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if I put on my other hat, my long term, I'll put on my long-term old money strategic hat. And I would say that the United States is too big and nothing can get done. And so the only way to move forward in the United States is to either break it up into small city states or go full bore into, smart cities and strong cities, which there is. It's kind of the same thing. Like, a smart city is a city run by a corporation. A strong city is a city run by a different type of corporation. And, it doesn't take a whole lot to start peeling back the onion. And you start hearing this talk about strong cities, smart cities, 15-minute cities.
Yeah, they're rolling them out.
Yeah, they're coming. And, I read this thing on 15-minute cities. I'd love to get your opinion on it. And in the idea of a 15-minute city, for those who may not know, I think Cleveland is talking about becoming one. I know that they've already rolled out one or two in the UK. And it's this idea that everything you need or could possibly want is within 15 minutes, whether walking or a bike ride. That means your shopping, your clothes, your work, your schools, everything is in this 15-minute radius. And it sounds like a nice way to
Sounds good on paper.
Sounds great on paper. You got this tight sardine place, everybody's working together. But you start looking at it and you're like, oh, you're not allowed to leave the 15-minute city. Pretty soon it starts sounding like a prison a little bit. Like, what do you mean I can't leave there? Oh, no, you can leave, but you can only leave 100 times a year. That's the end of mobility.
Right. Or you get charged for X amount of miles that you leave outside of the city. And so this is where they roll in the individual carbon footprint that they've been talking about. This is where, and in order to even leave those areas, you'll have to be part of that. You'll have to have the CDBCs. You'll have to, or CBDCs. You'll have to have the app that, is your social credit app, essentially. And if you don't, you won't even, there is no entry and exit access for you.
Yeah, there's your digital ID as well, right?
Yep. Yeah, so that all rolls together and it all ties together. And so, you'll be in a suburb of Chicago and they'll give you a monthly stipend of this central bank digital currency for, $4,000 a month. And that'll pay, it'll be calculated to pay exactly your region of where you rent,
Yeah.
what your groceries should be according to somebody's, plan. And that'll probably be, cockroaches and, other bugs of assortments, plus, whatever sort of vegetables can make it your way. And it'll kind of be like, remember the Hunger Games movie where they had all those
Yeah.
different districts? It'll be like that.
Man. Yeah, it's the Hunger Games meets Ready Player One, and you
Well,
start
they're
yeah.
trying for Ready Player One.
Yeah. I guess it's
that technology is kind of, hasn't quite made the cut just yet.
well, it doesn't take too much imagination to look at some of the cities. Pick the state that you live in. In some areas, they're nice areas. In some areas, they're shitty areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so why wouldn't they take all the homeless people and the crackheads and give them a visor and a video game and let them here? You guys just play in this opium den over here. We could shoot you up, play the video games. You're probably not going to be too hungry because we'll keep you on some stimulants, and they're going to keep those people out of trouble. And over here you have people that are, they're the betas. You got Brave New World on one side, Ready Player One over here, and then Hunger Games on this side, and they're going to try them all out, and see which one seems to work the best. It's just pick your dystopia. There it is.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably see a flavor of all of it.
Yeah.
In different areas. I mean, like you said, they're already rolling out a couple smart cities in the UK. They have some plans for some in Canada. There's I think it's cp40.org now, or cp30.org, where they're trying to make these mega cities. And within those mega cities, they'll basically have smart districts. They actually call them smart districts, which I thought was pretty interesting. But yeah, this is all a broadcasted plan. I mean, we have websites and PDFs and presentations and all sorts of things on, how this is all going to roll out.
Yeah, and what better way to do it when you have a series of manufactured crises? It's like leading the pigs to slaughter. You just keep narrowing that fence line. You keep narrowing until people have to file in, and they'll probably have people begging to get into the smart cities.
Oh, sure. I mean, imagine a place like East Palestine. It becomes unlivable from a real estate perspective. You're not going to be able to sell that property. So what's your option? If you were already in debt, I think credit card debt has passed $1 trillion, I read last week. So now if all of a sudden you're indebted to the system, your options become very limited. You're a pig filing in that line, ready to go for the slaughter. And happily so, because outside is, you don't have the skills, the resources, the know-how, the ability, the contacts, the network in order to survive. So that becomes, from, your perspective, the only path to survival.
Yeah, the path of despair seems to be, how you get to places of suffering, whether through inspiration or desperation. And I think that it seems to me the powers that be are done trying to inspire.
I think we lost that ticket a while ago.
Yeah, it blows my mind to think about where we are and where things are going. And another thing to think about is if you do find yourself, like where I live, I don't really leave Hawaii that often. And I, on some level, am subject to headlines and news and calling people in those areas to find out what's going on. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know what's happening in Ukraine. I'm not over there. I only can read the propaganda or do my best to search stuff out, but it's still limited. The same thing would be even more limited if you found yourself in a smart city or a strong city or one of these places. They can really tighten down what is possible, what you see, who you talk to, where you go. It's like the idea of the panopticon. They see everything.
Well, and I've also seen some AI systems rolling out where they're doing tests in those cities currently, where they have cameras set up on the street, people walking down the street. It goes over their face and it says, "Hey, it's George Monty." And it says 97% accurate, and then it pulls up George Monty's profile. And it's all of your social media accounts. It's all of your, and it gives you ratings on, what's your feelings towards the state, what's your feelings towards the economy, what's your feelings towards blah 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 blah, what your occupation is. And so these systems are being rolled out in these smart cities.
Man,
Yeah.
it's mind blowing to think about. I'm not even sure where to take it from there. It makes me think. Let's shift gears and talk about. I guess we're kind of on the same idea, but I hear a lot of people talking about the unipolar world versus the multipolar world, and I don't thoroughly know what if the strategy is much different. It's just instead of the USA having the petrodollar and running everything, now you have more of like districts running everything. But it seems to me everyone's pushing for the same technology, the same smart cities, the same sort of control. Do you think that that's accurate?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to think about it from somebody who wants to maintain a power structure / grow their influence and power. It's the only way to do it. I mean, it's similar to what's happening with Chat GPT these days. All of a sudden, everybody and their brother can go out and turn out content, can turn out images, can turn out all of these things. So how do you funnel that? How do you maintain a kind of a for lack of a better term, a social order? And you maintain that by becoming more authoritative, because if you allow people all of this kind of all of these tools at a common person level, now there's actually no need potentially for those oligarchs, for those big institutions. And so that's the fear from their perspective, if you will.
Wow.
And so that's what kind of funnels these things to happen at a global scale. Yeah, but whether that be the group of people sitting in the room saying, "Hey, we want a unipolar system. We want a one world government, essentially, that can manage all of this stuff," or you have some other people who are like, "I don't want your one world government, but I'm happy to rule over my little slice of land over here." The impetus to have those tools in check, to be able to regulate and be the authority on how those are utilized, is the same.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because when I look at ChatGPT or when I look at some of these new open AI tools people are using, and we may have covered this in a previous podcast, but I really think on some level that it erases the middleman. Like there's
Yeah.
really, if it gets good enough, there's really no need for a lawyer. There's really no need for a judge. And it would finally be equal justice under the law. It might not be great justice, but if it's equal justice for everybody, then who does that benefit? Well, it benefits the people that don't have access to justice, and it penalizes the people that can buy their way out of justice. And so
Exactly.
it's fascinating to think about it from that point of view.
Right. So then what would be your next step if you're on the side of somebody who can buy your way out? What would you attempt to do?
I'd shut it down. I don't want that. I've worked harder than these dummies down here. I'm better and smarter than them, right? Like
Or
that's probably the idea.
or you attempt to control it in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. And in some ways, you can see people saying that it's just a matter of time before Chat GPT and these tools become a subscription service. And
Well,
then
they
and then
are.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, did they change them already over?
Yeah,
Some of them?
I think ChatGPT, they have like their developer service now, so they started charging $20 a month or something like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. And then, if you think about that as a language, like we've both played around with it. And I think that we have both found that in some ways to be incredibly ingenious, and in other ways, maybe a little scary. But, I'll give you an example. I was using it for, I would use it for, to use it. I would prompt it with something like this. Speak, or not, I didn't say pretending, but in the form of provide me a title in the form of a viral video from a sociological point of view mixed with a podcasting point of view that is most likely to be up regulated by YouTube, and the titles, here's what I'm talking about. And it would print out like a list of 10 of them. And
Mhm.
I'll be damned if some of them I used, they were up 30% just from the title. I was like, well, same thing
Oh,
for
sure.
thumbnails. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and like we talked about before, it's such a valuable, potentially valuable tool.
Yeah.
Uh, the thing is it's simply just a tool too, because
Right.
and it's also a tool that's subjected to someone else's influence.
Mm,
So there's certain things in ChatGPT you can't ask it.
right.
You can't ask it whatever it deems offensive. You can't, and it does kind of it has a more liberal kind of slant to it. If you ask it to write some supporting document about like a Donald Trump or something like that, it won't do those things like it would if you were to ask it to write a supporting document about Bill Biden or Joe Biden's processes. You know, and it comes down to, well, who controls the reins on these things?
Mm-hmm.
And if all of a sudden you can control the people who can control the reins, well, then you control the flow of information.
Yeah, it's early on I had heard some people likening it to Google search, and even Google search was a little worried that people were using that instead. But what I
Mm-hmm.
have found that understanding the biases of ChatGPT, what it's censoring itself on, pulls back the curtain on what Google is censoring, because they're censoring the
Oh yeah.
same stuff. But
Yep.
Google, you don't really know, because no one looks past the first page. But you ask ChatGPT something, and it's like, I can't say that. And you go, oh, well, these are I think it was Voltaire who said, if you want to know who rules you, just think about who you can't criticize. And so you could just ask
Exactly.
ChatGPT and they'll tell you.
Yep. Well, and Google has been less less obscure about that in
Right.
recent years. It always says 8.7 billion results for your search, but if you actually start going down the pages, eventually you get to things and it starts saying omitted, 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 and starts to repeat the same stuff from pages 2 to 10. And when you go to other search engines that are a bit less censored, like a DuckDuckGo or something like that, you type in the same search, then all of a sudden you get a whole plethora of different results that you're like, oh, this is actually kind of what I was looking for. I don't care what 5 articles from NBC, CNN, Fox News, all of these people have to say. I was looking for the blogger who actually did the research and wrote about this. But you can't really find that on Google many times these days. So they've gotten less obscure about it, and it's a bit more on the nose these days.
Yeah, it's interesting to think. What has your take been? Like we talk a lot about the reaction to what's happening and what could happen because of that. But if we were to put on our best faces and talk about ways in which the common person could capitalize right now, what are some of the ideas you think that we could do to get things rolling on an individual level that could better people's lives?
Well, I mean, that's really going to depend on one's starting position.
Mm,
Um, Unfortunately, the game is so far down the line that if you don't have real estate, or you never had the opportunity to own real estate or own your home or own an apartment or own a condo or something like this, the likelihood that you're going to be subjected to what's coming next is very high. From an individual level, this is the time where you really need to put your head on straight and start being realistic about what's happening in this world. You have a lot of evidence in front of you now that is, telling you that things are not going to get better. They're definitely going to get worse for the common person. Uh, you know, Survival skills are probably something that should be at the top of people's list. Being in good shape should be at the top of people's list. Practicing good nutrition. Um, Finding a good spiritual regimen, whether that just be through meditation or the use of psychedelics, which we're fond of talking about, uh, and finding yourself a solid community of like-minded people.
yeah, it's true. I just looking at what's been happening thus far, you can never imagine what's happening, and the way the cleanup or the way the government, the cities, the world is reacting to the situation on some level seems like a panic, and on another level seems like a capitalization on weak people.
Oh
You
yeah.
know,
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, look what's happening in the Netherlands. You know, that was one of the first things we talked about when we started
Yeah,
podcasting together.
yeah,
And now look where that's gone. Now it went from just, oh, they may do this, to where they're actually trying to actively seize, 3,000 plus farms. The protests have gotten to the point where now they've brought in the military to put down the protests. And that, so we're watching these things happen at a faster and faster clip. Things that were like, oh, that might be something that could be troublesome in the future. Well, the future is now. I mean, we're walking day by day. I mean, last week, if you were to ask anybody that listens to mainstream media, anybody who even does their own research, do you think there's going to be a bank run next week? You're going to get a 99.9% of people be like, I don't know. I haven't seen anything about that. Haven't heard anything about that. Probably not. Here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, before we were blindsided by the bank runs, it seemed to me that, it's pretty hard to look at all these train derailments and not see any pattern there. And I'm a big fan of patterns. And, if you look back at, there's a lot of train derailments, but why was there like 7 in Ohio? Why were they all in front of the water? Why were they all in front of chemical or metal plants? Or, like that to me seems out of the ordinary,
Well, and also, why was the solution to blow the damn thing up?
Yeah.
How did that get past? We have an EPA, we have all sorts of government agencies that should have put the kibosh on that, before it even had a chance to pass, an executive's door. But yet they announced that they were going to blow it up. Nobody told them no, and then they blew it up. And it's not just the train derailments. Before that, we've had, more distribution centers go up in flames than we ever have. We've had more animal processing centers go up in flames. Maybe people are cashing in on the insurance. Sure. All of them doesn't seem like it's a likely possibility.
Yeah. I forgot who said it, but they said I think there was a great old radio guy named John B. Wells, and he used to be on, he has a show called Midnight to Caravan, but he used to be on with George Norrie, who did that great late night show. And he had this saying, and he said, the thing about World War III is you won't know who you're going to be. You won't know who the enemy is. Mm-hmm. And it just seems that, it wasn't too long ago that Seymour Hersh came out and he was talking about the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, and he showed the evidence. He showed here's the guys that did it. Here's how they did it. Here's the timeline. Here's Victoria Nuland saying stuff. Here's Joe Biden saying stuff. And then almost after that, you get what could be, at least in my opinion, considered a dirty bomb. That train could very well be considered a dirty bomb. When you look at the people that are having, they have skin rashes and burns and they can't breathe. Like that's the first sign of radiation poisoning, and we don't know what was on that train. It was quarantined off and they set it on fire. That's, if you want to get rid of the evidence, you burn it. You know what I mean? When you want to get rid of evidence, you don't hide it. You don't put it under the seat cushion. You burn it. You get rid of it. You don't let anybody see it. And maybe there was chemicals going to build weapons. Maybe there was chemical waste on there they didn't want people to know about. But, it seems like it could have been a dirty bomb, and it seemed like it could have been a tit for tat, Nord Stream. Okay, here's your infrastructure done. And if that's the case, why wouldn't all those other things be destruction of the supply chain? Like that destroys the U.S. And it makes sense. If we're at war, we've already been told we're in a proxy war. We're in a war with Russia. Russia's not going to come over and put troops on the ground. China's not putting troops on the ground. But how can you possibly defend the border? How could you possibly defend the millions of miles of tracks? Like, you can't. It's open, and
Yep.
that's what people would hit. So I mean, it seems to me like you can make that case, and I tried to make that argument. Yeah, we're at war. There's a guerrilla war going on right now. That's acts of terrorism right there.
Oh yeah, and in addition to that, um, there's been a concerted effort over the past few years from the hacking space to hack industrial controllers. To hack all of these things that run all of the infrastructure, all of the electricity, all of the water, all of the waste management systems, the railways, all of these things. And from chatter, it looks like it's state-sponsored groups. And now all of a sudden, fast forward a few years later, and you have an uptick in train derailments. You have an uptick in distribution fires. You have all of these supply chain ailments that are now afflicting not just here, but in a lot of Western nations.
That reminds me of the there was a recent sort of remember Event 201 was what they had prior to COVID. A few years ago, they had like the internet blackout games, and I think it was Russia who was pretending to be the bad guy. Okay, here's one for everybody. The next shoe to drop, you heard it here first, is going to be the internet blackout. I think that's the next shoe to drop. Whether it's hacking on one side or it's the takedown of the grid on one side, but I think the next shoe to drop, and you know what? I'll put a date on it. I'll tell you next Thursday. Next Thursday, you're going to see an internet blackout. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a truck driver. I know these things.
That's a hell of a prediction.
I'll make you famous. Let's put it on the True Life podcast right now. Next Thursday, internet blackout. Everybody be ready. It's coming. It's going to be blamed on Russia, state-sponsored. You're going to see the takedown of multiple banks and probably the Austin grid. Why not?
Well, the Austin grid goes down if it just sprinkles a little. So I don't know if that's a great prediction. Yeah. But no, I think we're definitely going to see more and more of these things roll out. In fact, there already is effectively an internet blackout.
Right.
We don't know what's happening in China. We don't know what's happening in Ukraine. We get little tidbits and pieces. It's interesting when like the Iraq war happened, right? This was 30 years ago. Well, 25, 26, 27 years ago. There was journalists everywhere. It was being live broadcast. We watched every single bit of that war, right?
Yep.
Have you seen anything from Ukraine like that?
Nothing.
Me either.
Yeah. Yeah, imagine that. I've heard people tell some stories about videos on Discord or something that look like World War II videos, like trench warfare and stuff like that. But I haven't seen any of them. And I hear stories about both sides running out of ammo. And if you watch the news in a Western country, what you see is this idea that Russia's about to fold. But if you peel back that onion and you start looking at websites like New Eastern Outlook, or you start listening to people like Scott Ritter, you realize like they're not even trying yet. Like Russia's, if you look back at their history, they will roll out millions of people and just lay them all out until it's over. Like they have a history of doing that. And you tell me they keep over you nothing to them.
Right. And you have to remember, this whole offensive in Ukraine started with 125,000 people. Russia's population is estimated some 80 million people. I mean, when we're talking like the amount of bodies that could be thrown at this thing, it hasn't even begun. They just conscripted another, I think, 300,000 to 400,000 people. So now you're talking 4 times as many people invading than the initial invasion. Yeah, this thing is like we talked last year, and you said, do you think this dies out? Do you think this kind of goes away and gets settled up? And I said, I don't think so. I think this continues to roll out. And I think it continues to roll out. I don't think at this point, from just a interior perspective of Russia as a Putin, as a leader of that country, you can't back out now.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're standing in the ring with the person you're going to fight, and haymakers are already being thrown. You don't quit. You're not quitting. You're throwing back haymakers. Now it's a real fight.
Yeah, I would say you've got the guy on the ropes and he's desperately trying to tag his partner, but you got him in a headlock. You're choking him out. Like there's nothing. There's not one thing Ukraine can do to Russia without the help of the United States.
Right.
Nothing.
Yeah.
They're done.
100%.
They are. And you know what? Like I thought about it like this. If you look at the way in World War I or World War II, the way Great Britain used Hitler as like a proxy to start pushing into Russia, the same thing is I think that Europe is using Ukraine the same way they use Nazi Germany. They're using them as like this cudgel to try to take shots at Russia and bring down like this so-called threat that they think it is. And unlike, it seems to me from what I've read, Hitler stopped playing along with the powers of Europe. It's like, you know what? I'm gonna do my own thing. Thanks for all the money. Thanks for everything. I'm gonna do my own thing. And then that's when they turned on him. Zelensky will never do that. Zelensky is their whipping boy. He's gonna do whatever they say or he's dead. And so, he's just gonna keep pushing. And I think that, I recently read that we have Ukrainian pilots in the United States training on planes, which means it's just a matter of time before they start putting planes in the air and it's game over there. It's already game over, but you get a plane with a U.S. tail number on there flying over Moscow or something like that. It really escalates the pot right there.
Well, I've actually seen reports of from a lot of different NATO countries now that you clearly U.S. planes, no U.S. tail marking on them, no markings whatsoever on them. So I think that will be the next phase of this, because as Russia brings down another few 100,000 people, the Ukrainian army doesn't have the ability to withstand that, and the only way to combat that will be with some air power. And I think Russia hasn't been sitting on their heels since the Cold War.
Right.
Granted, they might not be as technologically advanced. They might have not as many cool tools, but they have, Russia's been long in the war game. This isn't their first rodeo. And it's always been Russia's game where they kind of start tentatively and then they just continue to ramp it up and ramp it up and ramp it up. And to think that they don't have some stuff to deploy, I mean, they've already shot hypersonic missiles, right? Yeah. So hypersonic missile technology is not an easy thing. And to think that that's just the pinnacle of their technology is probably a bit naive.
Yeah, let us not forget they're the first ones in space. Right. They're the only ones to get there now.
Well, Elon could get you to space.
Probably, yeah. Yeah. It's it's interesting when I look at Russia, I look at the breakdown of the Soviet Union and how all the oligarchs came in and they just took everything over. And then it took Putin to push those people, at least some of them, out. I mean, he didn't get rid of all of them.
He used some of them.
Yeah, he did. And he imprisoned a lot of them. And if you look at that model, you go, oh, you could see why the people in Russia love Putin. It's like, dude, they were ruled by these crazy oligarchs that were just that look a lot like that model of the Soviet Union dying and being privately owned by oligarchs looks a lot like what's happening in the United States right now. Yep. And if you look at China, what does China do? China put away who was they had a really big guy that owned like Tencent, or he owned Jack Ma.
Alibaba.
Yeah, he started getting pretty big for his britches, and then all of a sudden you saw Z go, you know what? Come here for a minute. You take a little time out. You didn't hear about him for a few months.
He went to a reprogramming camp.
That's right. On some level, you got to look at China and Russia standing up against the oligarchs, and it's sad to think about it, but anybody who wants to have an open mind should look at what's happening in the United States. Like, we are being more and more privatized, run by oligarchs. And you could also say that's why, look at all these calamities that are happening. There's no more restraints. There's no more, things in order that stop the oligarchs from doing what they want. There's no more penalties for them. And you have train derailments, you have bank bailouts, all these people that were clamoring, oh, regulations are too tight. Well, guess what? We tried something, we took away all the regulations, and now look, everything's going to hell.
Yep. Well, and if you think about it, this is kind of like the ebb and flow of human history and nation states. Mm-hmm. You always have this aristocratic oligarchic class of people that are always trying to regain their former influence, their power, whatever, and then they eventually do. And then you have a Putin or Xi or somebody like that come in and bring order to the chaos, so to speak. And in doing so, they gain this authoritarian, thing. And then from that authoritarianism, you have kind of like a democracy that's born. And then you have the rise of the oligarchs again, of the aristocracy again. I mean, this has happened for as long as we've been recording history.
Yeah. Hey, there was a really good book I read, I think last year. It was called 2032. And it was written by a rear admiral. I forgot the guy's name. And it was clearly, it's a work of fiction, but it must have been based on some sort of military game, because the premise of the book was something along the lines of a battle group sails through the, close to Taiwan, through the China Sea. They come upon a distressed fishing boat. They get on that boat and they see that there is this piece of technology that the fisherman refuses to give up. And so they finally get that guy on board, and they're questioning him, and they're like, what is this technology you have here? And then the book shifts from that scene to Washington, D.C., where the ambassador from China is knocking on like the vice president's door, is like, hey, you have one of our fishing boats. I want that thing released now. And if it's not released, there's going to be some problems. And then it's a really good book. People should check it out. I think it's called 2032. And I won't spoil it for everybody, but long story longer, there's a lot of talks about a limited capable nuclear strike on the United States and how that plays back and forth. There's like a 1-2 punch, and I'll leave it there for people to think about. But, it's clearly something that was thought about. It was some type of war game that had probably been taught to him, and they had obviously gamed it out. But, it's interesting how close we are to that book right now, and what could happen, and how much of a good strategy that would be. And, we talked about different kinds of technology that could possibly be on the board. It's pretty fascinating to think about.
Yeah, I think, the idea of a limited nuclear strike 20 years ago was, that would never happen.
Right.
But now you have hypersonic delivery systems. Those basically negate the functionality of all missile defense systems that have been created to date. They fly too low and too fast. The whole idea of accepting or intercepting an intercontinental ballistic missile was because it has to go up and then come down. And so you have some time to intercept it as it's rising up into the stratosphere. But with these hypersonic missiles, it's A to B. And, you're talking 30 minutes from Moscow to New York.
Yeah, and that's just the stuff we know about,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
God forbid there's some sort of space-based weapon that the rods from God or whatever they are, and
yeah. And with how much stuff is up there, who's to say there's not? I mean, you only need, I think, what was it? It was only like a 2-ton tungsten rod to really destroy like the city center of like a size of a London.
Yeah.
Right? That's not a heavy payload for what we've been launching into space over the past 30, 40 years.
Yeah. Yeah. It come in, it's crazy to think that there's probably boardrooms or war rooms where people have mapped out first strike capabilities and responses to that. And, people had sat back and been like, well, I think we can win this. It's crazy to think that someone would say that, but I'm sure it's happened.
Oh, sure. I mean, well, that's probably a yearly exercise at military headquarters around the world.
Yeah.
If we decided on this first strike action, what would be the consequences? Oh, we got a 25% chance to come out of this one smelling like roses.
Yeah.
Yeah, 75% of the people will be dead, but we'll win.
Yeah. There's the old gosh, I can't think of the name of it. It was it'll probably come to me in a minute, and then I could probably put the notes in the chat. But there was this website that popped up in like 2012, something like that, and it was like a military contracting website. And I remember just being mind blown about it because it had all the statistics for that day. It had all the countries named, and then it had population. It had size of the army, size of the GDP, and it was like all these statistics about each country. And then it showed 2023, and I remember specifically that the United States went from like 330 million to like 325,000. Britain dropped way down, and like all these countries dropped way down, and it caused this big hullabaloo because people are like, who is this military contract site, and why is the U.S. going from 340 million to 325,000? Like, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, that website was wiped off the map like 4 years later, and it's not up there anymore. But it's it's interesting to think about, and if there was a first strike, if there was a limited nuclear strike, like let's just say that the United States begins to blockade China, or China begins to blockade Taiwan, and then, China fires something at, like, say, Texas or Washington, D.C. Is the United States really have are they really going to fire something back at China after we've been hit by a nuclear strike in the United States? I mean, do we have the fortitude to do that? Do the people are like, whoa, wait a minute. What are we going to do? We're going to fire a nuclear strike at this other country because they hit us over here? What happens at that point in time? Or do they go, you know what? We don't need a nuclear bomb. We have a biological weapon, but it just seems like we're too close to, like, all this rhetoric sometimes can end up becoming more than rhetoric. And it just takes, if you look back at history, you see the guys in the subs that didn't pull the trigger or got in the way of the orders and stuff. It's crazy to think where we are.
Indeed. And, to that point a bit, I was watching Joe Rogan and Eric Weinstein the other day, and he talked about, he mentioned that people today alive don't know what the power of a nuclear weapon is. We haven't seen a nuclear weapon tested, since, certainly after World War II, really, beginning of the Cold War. It's been 70 some years since a nuclear blast has been detonated on the at least the surface of the earth. So there's just a lack of intimacy with what that actually means, what sort of destruction, what sort of, and the ones that were detonated, those were small compared to what was actually built. I mean, we have these thermonuclear warheads that are just, wild. They even dwarf what the Tsar Bomba, which was I think the biggest H bomb that was detonated, and they dwarf that. I mean, we're talking destruction that just is unfathomable. And so there's just a lack of appreciation for what that actually means. It's the person sitting there talking trash, and then, they talk shit to the wrong person, and that person just happens to be, a black belt martial artist, and just lays the whooping on them. Yeah. And because there's just a lack, nobody's been punched in the face for 30 years, right? And so when people don't have the ability to understand that, the consequences of these actions, of this rhetoric, we quickly walk ourselves into a corner where, I mean, you could have these nuclear strikes happen. And then to your question of, what happens at that point, do we have the wherewithal? Do we have the fortitude to go off and strike back? Do we even have, I mean, would it be, I guess it would require an act of Congress, right? How are you going to get this Congress to agree to something like that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know either. What do you give any credence to the idea that it's all like an attempt to bolster both economies? Is everybody just at a point where there's no progress, there's no technology moving us forward, we're at a standstill, so we are banging the war drums, but secretly Russia, the US, Great Britain's just all kind of behind the scenes, just trying to push people to create and to release this thing called evolution and creativity, and trying to scare us into making the next leap forward.
That would require some considerable level of evidence of altruistic behaviors from authoritarian figures. I personally haven't seen evidence like that in my life, nor have I seen it in studying the history of humanity. I mean, it's kind of a rosy thought. I don't see it. I wouldn't give too much credence to it personally. What about you?
Sometimes I think that, and this is just me thinking wildly, but I think that there's some evidence to show, and this is kind of dark, but some people tend to believe that warfare is the highest virtue of mankind. And they say that because that is where the idea of progress comes from. If you just leave people to themselves, they just want to dance and party and have a great time, and they're not really hip on killing each other. So you have to force them into this mode where they have to fight for their lives. And when you do that, that's when you get the giant leaps in progress. That's when you get the giant leaps in technology. And it seems for a long time in the same maybe it wasn't Weinstein and Rogan, but Peter Thiel recently gave a speech at the Oxford Union. And in that speech, he talked about how there's been no real technological advances in the last 30 years. We were supposed to have the Jetsons flying cars, and we got 140 characters. And so this idea of war, this idea of scaring people, this idea of I'm going to steal everything from you until you make, it's like the old Rumpelstiltskin, turn this into gold. I think there's been evidence of people using those tactics to push the human race forward. So I guess that would be my answer to that.
I mean, yeah, I've definitely heard people talk about that. But I think that almost would be something to disguise other motives. I think if I was, a super billionaire on this world, looking at what's happening in the world, we have an explosion of populations that are demographically vastly different than the current power structures in the world. And that's going to unbalance the system that, I'm a part of. So while I certainly, war does lead to progress, I don't think there's any real argument against that. I think that's just kind of the veneer behind the actual motivation, of, say, maintaining a power structure or growing a power structure. Because, even if, even two things can be true at once in this instance, right? Like a warlord, yeah, he knows by, going to war, all of a sudden, we're going to have factories opening up. We're going to have workers in those factories. There's going to be innovation because people want to protect their families. But at the same time, he's not necessarily doing it for the progress and the innovation. He's doing it for the resources, the power, the maintaining of everything he's known.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the strategy behind the games and the real people pulling the levers and the people they use to be out in front. And on some level, as conspiracy minded as I am, I often fall back on there's way too many moving parts in order for some things to happen. And that's probably true. Like you said, both things can be true at once. I'm sure some people have grand plans, but it's easy to disrupt those plans if you just put some goo in the gear.
Yeah, well, Yeah, there are so many moving parts, and I think that's kind of why we're seeing the world the way the way it is today.
Yeah.
If there wasn't so many moving parts, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation on the internet.
Yeah.
People wouldn't be talking about these things. There were, uh, we would still have a Walter Cronkite who told us exactly how to think and feel about everything that was happening in the world, based upon a very narrow set of information. Uh, but I think there is goo in the system because there are so many moving parts, and I think that we're witnessing the seizing of the system at some level. We're witnessing people try to repair the system. We're witnessing other people just saying, "Put it down a gear and hit the gas."
Yeah.
And so we're in the midst of that actuality.
Let me take a hard right turn right here and throw this one at you. You know, what do you think about the idea that what we are seeing in the world today is the unrealized dreams of the boomers dying? If you look at all the octogenarians that are in positions of authority, be it in corporations, boards of directors, be it Putin or whether it's Biden, there's all these ideas about legacy. There's all these unrealized dreams of this giant class of people that have been spoiled their whole lives and been given everything. And now all of a sudden they're knocking on death's door like, what do you mean I'm not God's gift to the earth? What do you mean my mom's not going to do this? What do you mean my dad's not going to give me this thing? Like, I think that there's a lot of boomers out there that are finally coming to the realization that they were given everything and that they are not gonna they're not God's gift to the world and that they are going to die. They're not going to live forever, regardless of how much money you sink into longevity pills, and you don't have time to take care of your family, and you want a legacy, you better act out now. And I think that there's something to be said about the species on the planet and a large part of that species dying, like part of the human race, a
Mhm.
large part of our form is dying, and it's fighting tooth and nail to stay alive. And I think that that's the boomer class.
I would agree that that's certainly happening in multiple different scales, right? You have the personal scale, you have the family, you have
Right.
things like that, but then you do have these Bidens and Trumps and people like that who
Right.
are they're trying to play young man's games when they're at the end of their era.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that definitely plays into some of it, and I also think that there's another component of it that's there's multi-generational things at play too. You have these families and systems that are so broad and so vast that have so much actual wealth. They're not the people you read about on the Forbes top 10 list. They're the people that make the people on the Forbes top 10 list look like they're poor. And I think there is a component of those multi-generational plans for structuring of society and all of these things that are really old school ideas that were born back in the Renaissance era of things, that are also playing into this as well. I think there's just a confluence of different ideologies, narratives, plans, goals, legacies, all just kind of hitting together all at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how about this one then? What about this not being the first time this has happened? What about there being a plan to wipe off, 70 or 80% of the people on the planet and having a small breakaway society of people keeping all the relevant knowledge? And I know this kind of seems way out there, but what the hell? If you look at the way technology's been rolled out, in some ways, it, you look back and you're like, hey, Einstein didn't write all that. Hey, this guy didn't come up with that. Hey, you know what? This whole idea about history and the Bible, maybe there weren't Greeks. Maybe that was the Middle Ages, and like you start realizing that even though Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History because he thought it was over, it really means like the end of everybody's history. It kind of means history was bullshit. And so, what about this being a cycle that happens? What about there being certain families that have histories of like, yeah, every now and then we got to wipe out the human race and start over. I think that there is credence to that, whether maybe I'm reading too much sci-fi or maybe I've gone too deep down too many rabbit holes, but is that something that you have ever thought about before?
Yeah, I've thought about it. And I also have come at it from a different perspective
Okay.
in that um, these cycles are not necessarily driven by humanity, but are driven by the circumstance of humanity on this planet. Meaning that, we've talked about the Milosevic cycles, and
Yes.
there is a consistent history of extinction level events on this planet. And who's to say that if you're in a position with you've gathered tons of knowledge and resources from all over the world, and all of a sudden you're aware that something like this is going to happen, what sort of the moves and some of the actions we're seeing today would fall right in line with, hey, I know there's a coming end of this cycle, so guess what, this is what we're going to do. And we've had like the Adam and Eve story we've talked about before,
right.
And when you look at like solar cycles and things like that, which I've done a lot of research on, I think that there probably is a cyclical disaster that does befall humanity, and there is a group of people who preserve knowledge and rebirth society at large, and then that knowledge is squirreled away and lost over time to the vast majority of people, except there's record of it. We see from geological records from our modern science to things like megalithic structures all over the world, some of which we still can't even fathom on how to build. And so I think there is probably a cyclical disaster. And if I knew about that and I had a whole bunch of resources, I would play the game in a similar way that it's being played.
Yeah. And everyone would think you're crazy. They just think you're a weirdo. Like, look at this lunatic. The sky is falling. The sky is falling.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. Well, Ben, I have an absolute blast talking to you, and I'm looking forward
Likewise,
to us getting back on a more regular scale. But before I let you go, what do you have coming up? Where can people find you, and what are you excited about?
BenjaminCGeorge.com is where I can be found. Coming up, hopefully some new podcasting stuff. I've been doing the entrepreneurial thing for the past month and a half, 2 months, and seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. So hopefully I'll have some more fun things and announcements. I got a bunch of like individual podcast episodes, things about the book, a second edition of the book pretty much written, some other stuff like that. I just haven't had the time to put the final 5% on it and hit publish or hit broadcasts or what have you. So hopefully get some of that out here soon. But I'm definitely excited for that. Excited to talk to you again. It's always great talking to you.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine. Yeah, I'd love to get back and get some more ideas about the book back on there.
Yeah, for sure. And I did want to make that point earlier. I think part of what people can do is a personal philosophy and how we view the world. You can let these things be a burden on your shoulders and tear you down, or through your philosophy and outlook and research and experimentation and all of this, you can find solutions to these problems. And so that's kind of in the next rewrite of the book here, volume 2.
Yeah, I like it. And I would add to that, try and produce as much as you consume, try and
Sure.
create the life that you want to live, and take care of the people you love and spend time with them, and try to make everyone around you better. And in doing so, you make your own life better. So that's what we got for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the time. Benjamin C. George, thank you for the time. And we'll be back again next week. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Aloha.